started. Assignment 2.
Greetings.
Okay. Yeah, it's not due till tonight, right? But
What?
it's not due till tonight, right? So there's
Well,
probably.
assignment 2 is due like the 28th.
Oh
But
yeah.
the 24th.
I don't think assignment 3. Gotcha.
And we just forgot to figure it
No, that's fine.
Yeah, like some of them are done, but there's still.
Oh, you could also go in and put in the grades for the lab if you want to too. I think it's 20 points. And just if they've submitted it.
Okay.
Just give them points. Okay, guys, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. We're going to start looking at some actual style properties that we can do in our CSS. So just as a recap, we've talked about selectors. So we've talked about how to write selectors to target specific elements with our styles in our CSS. There's some more selectors that are available that we're not really going to use in this class. They get a little bit more complicated. So we'll talk about a couple of them as we go along, but there's what are called pseudo selectors where you can target other properties of elements other than just their type or their ID or their class. So like you can target an element by name if it's a form input, or even just by arbitrary attributes. You can also do some like first of type selector. So you could say select all A's and then do first of type with class important or something. So there's some kind of more complex selectors you can use to really get specific. You can select like every odd element, stuff like that. I find that those are more single purpose. Every once in a while you'll find a chance where you need to use them, but they're not super useful on a day-to-day basis. So I'm going to kind of leave those up to you to learn on your own if you're interested in them. As I mentioned, I posted in Slack the link to the full version of the lab that we went through, and they cover those other element types or those other selector types. So if you're interested, you can go through that, and they kind of there on the right, they walk you through, the documentation for that type of selector that you need to use. So feel free to go through that if you're interested. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to talk about styling text today and different style properties that we have available to adjust the look of our text. So first, a little bit about fonts. So there's some different types of fonts that we kind of need to be aware of. So the first is serif fonts. These have some extra stroke details. It's kind of inspired by calligraphy, traditionally used for longer passage of text in print. Some examples are like Georgia, Times New Roman, kind of the classic fonts. Usually is the default on your text editor. It's what newspapers use. It's kind of the classic font. So you can see these are called ligatures. So like on the P, there's like little lines on each side. Of the P or of the I. All the letters, have little stroke details added to them. So again, they kind of come from in calligraphy, the way that you form letters. It's not as extreme as you would see in calligraphy, but there's little, stroke marks where they would be in calligraphy. So it's kind of nice. It allows the text to flow a little more easily if you're reading longer passages. It also has kind of an outdated look in some senses too, though. So a lot of modern websites don't use serif fonts unless they're for like a heading or some sort of style reason. So next we have sans serif fonts. They have straight insta letters. They don't have the little extra details. It's a much cleaner and more modern design. So you can see like, for example, in the N here, it's got the little ligature marks. Here it doesn't. It's just a straight into it. They're also typically a little bit more even in like the stroke. For instance, I don't know, like the E here, the little cross part is thinner than the rest of the letter, whereas the E in a sans serif font is typically all of the strokes are even width, so there's not as much kind of detail in the font. So some examples are like Arial, Helvetica, Verdana. Those are kind of some of the most popular ones. So for most websites, a sans serif font improves readability and design aesthetics. So using the sans serif font kind of gives a more modern, updated look. It's also a little bit more readable. Serif fonts are designed for print, so it makes sense when you're reading print, but when we're dealing with pixels on a screen, serif fonts can kind of they lose some of their detail because pixels can't fully represent, those curves necessarily, and so it can be a little bit harder to read. So sans serif fonts are a little bit easier to read on a screen. There's also monospace fonts, so they have equal widths for all letters, hence monospace. So you notice here, like the L's here are the same width as the A, whereas like the L's here in calligraphy, like the LL and the I are all more narrow than say the C. So typical fonts will adjust the amount of space that a letter takes up based on the amount of space it needs. Whereas a monospace font uses an equal width for every letter. So think of like a typewriter. Typewriters typically are monospace fonts. It's really great for presenting code examples or other technical information. Your code editors will use monospace fonts most of the time. You can change it, but most people prefer to use a monospace font when dealing with code because then everything is spaced a little bit more evenly and precisely and predictably. So if you use monospace for your code editor, it kind of helps things make a little bit more sense. So some examples are Courier, Courier New, Inconsolata is a popular one now that I use for my code editor. So yeah, those kind of the three main different types of fonts. So when we're talking about how to specify the font face on our website, we use the font family property, which will allow you to specify the typeface that should be used for any text inside the elements that a CSS rule is targeting. So it's kind of important to note any text inside the element. So you'll target like a P, and then any text inside of that P will have that font. Or you could target a div and then say there's several P's and an A and some headings inside that div. The font family will apply to all of the text inside that element that you targeted. The value of the property is the name of the typeface that you want to use. But an important note is that users visiting your site need to have the typefaces installed in order to be able to see them. So typically, your computers have kind of a default set of fonts installed on them that's pretty large, and it's pretty relatively standard across Macs and Windows and Linux or whatever. There's kind of some set fonts that are installed by default. But you don't want to use any super fancy fonts. Say you've gone to, fonts.com and downloaded some cool font and put it on your website. You can't just necessarily give that font name because most of your users may not have that font installed. So there's some ways to get around that we'll talk about. But you need to think about if the users visiting your site are going to have that font installed. And if not, you need to be able to provide a fallback font name with more generic fonts to what you're using. So here's an example of how we do that. So we've got the font family property. We set Arial as the font, so for some element that we've selected. But then you use commas to separate the fallbacks. So we've got Verdana as the first fallback. So if Arial doesn't exist, which would be rare, but it could happen. So the user doesn't have the Arial font installed, we'll go to Verdana as a default. If they don't have that installed, we can provide a generic form of the font to just say, okay, any sans serif font that you have, and the browser will usually have a default font for each type. So it's really important to usually like to provide 3 options. Provide kind of your preferred option, provide a reasonable fallback that should be like a kind of like Times New Roman or something that everyone should have, but then also have just the type of font as the third fallback. So if the user doesn't have any fonts installed, there should be something that at least matches the style of the font you're going for. One note too, any font names that have a space in them should be wrapped in quotes. So like Courier New, you would wrap those in quotes in your font family property. Questions so far? Okay, so here's an example where we target our H1s and our H2s. We've set font family. We set Courier New in quotes because it has a space in there. But then we have Courier as a fallback, and then Monospace as the third fallback. So Monospace is just the generic type of font that is. So we say, okay, if you don't have either of those, just use a Monospace font. And that way it'll at least still look the same if it doesn't have any fonts installed. Okay, so size of type. So the font size property allows you to specify a size for the font. There are kind of three different ways to specify the size. So first is by pixels. So you could do font size 12 pixels. That's kind of a set size. It's going to be the same on every browser, the same on multiple devices. It's a fixed size of however many pixels you want the font to be. That's kind of going to be the default. It's the most straightforward. It's the most predictable. You can also use a percentage. So you can say font size 200%, and that will take whatever the default font size for the browser is and just do a larger font size than that. That can be really useful when, it's a percentage of the parent element's font size. So when you say 200%, it looks at the parent element. So say this is like a paragraph inside of a div or a heading inside of a div. On the div, you've said font size is 12 pixels, but on my heading, I want font size to be 200%. It'll actually be 200% of 12 pixels, so it'll be 24 pixels. So that's a nice way to have kind of one. A lot of times on websites I'll set one font size on the whole, on everything, like just on the body, and then I'll use percentages on my headings and stuff like that to kind of make things a little bit bigger, a little bit smaller. So it's relative to the parent element's font size. IMs, however, are another way to kind of be a little bit more adaptive. So you can do a value in IM. So 1.1 IM is just the default browser font size, and then you can go up in usually some sort of decimals. So like 2 IMs is pretty large. It's similar to a percentage. It's relative to the parent. It's kind of a complicated metric to explain exactly what it means, but it's really nice to use IMs actually because it's more adaptive to the screen's font size. So when you think of like a mobile device, you want the font usually to be a little bit bigger than you want it to be on your desktop. IMs will adjust for that. So if you use IMs, it's relative to the default font size on the device, which your phone knows to usually make the font a little bit bigger. So using IMs is kind of relative to a baseline that will adjust based on the device. So I like to make a habit of using IMs wherever I can because they tend to work the best across multiple devices. For best readability, you should make sure your body text is no smaller than 1 M, which again is kind of the default, or 16 pixels usually we like to say is kind of a default for main body text. So that's like your paragraphs and stuff like that. You can have some elements that are smaller than that. If you have some links somewhere, some navigation, that's fine. But as a general rule, your main long-form body text should be no smaller than that. That's also kind of part of the American Disabilities Act recommendations as well. They don't like to see too small of text on your website. Okay, questions so far? Yep. Yeah, so percentage is relative to the parent. So whatever your parent element's font size is. IMs, this isn't a very good explanation. It's similar to percentage, but it's actually relative to the browser's default. So like 1 M is just whatever your browser's default font size is. So the parent being, so you could set like a div to font size 12 pixels, and then a paragraph within that div to font size 200 pixels, and the paragraph that's nested inside that div would then be 200% of 12 pixels. Whereas IMs is more, it's not relative to the parent, and if you had a div that's 12 pixels, and then you say 1.3 M, that's kind of, it's more relative to a baseline that's set by the browser, if that makes sense. So IMs are relative to just whatever your browser says the font size should be, percentages are relative to whatever the parent element is. Okay, so if you do need to include a file for a font, so say you found some awesome font that you want to use on your website, you totally can, but you need to provide the font file so the browser can download the font to the user's computer. So there's this @font face. It's not really a property, I guess. It's just a feature of CSS that we use to specify the URL to the font file. So there's a source attribute where we specify the path to the font. So it can be relative. So you can include a font file inside your website files. Just put it in the folder where your HTML file is, and then you can load it just relative to your HTML file. Or it can be absolute if you want to, like Google will usually host some fonts for you. They have some free services where you can include fonts from Google's websites. So you can use an absolute path to just include it from Google. That way you don't have to host it. You also have to provide a format attribute to provide the name of the format or the name of the format of the font. And then you use font family attribute to give it the name of the font that you're going to use within your CSS. I'll show an example of this in a little bit. You do need to provide multiple formats for different browsers. This isn't as big of an issue now. It used to be IE would kind of use different formats, and your mobile phones would use a little bit different formats, but now there's kind of some standard formats. OTF will work for the most part across all browsers. But then, so you use @fontface to provide the URL to the font to tell the browser to download it, but then you still need to apply the font with the font family declaration in a separate rule. So step 1 is including the file, and then step 2 is applying that font to some text on your page. There's also some services like Google Fonts, which will use or provide the CSS for you. So you typically don't have to do your own, font face rules unless you've got some custom font you downloaded or something that's non-standard and you need to include it from a file. I've done this a couple of times on different websites where I've been working for a client and they had a graphic designer design, their page and their headings have a certain font, and you have to go buy a license for that font and download the files and include on your site. So I'll show you an example. So first we do @fontface. We provide the font family. So this is the name that we give it. This can actually be anything. It doesn't really have to be, exactly what the font is named or anything. It's just whatever the font family name we give it here is then what we use later on in our CSS. So this could be XYZ and then XYZ here, and it's still going to be tied to this file. But then we do source with URL, and then the font file. There's a missing single quote there. So you've got the URL. So this is a relative path. So this is just a fonts folder in our website that then has the TTF file in it. And then we've got format, which is true type in this case. So TTF is a true type font format. So we give it that. So once we've declared our font face, the browser says, okay, I need to go download this file and install this font. So it will do that. And then later on in our CSS, we can, say, okay, this paragraph we want font family to be chunkified regular, and it'll reference that font. Does this make sense? Any questions? Again, if you're I recommend using Google Fonts or like Typekit or something like that, because then you don't really have to manage this. Because one problem you run into is licensing. So if you go to dafont.com or fonts.com or something, typically, sometimes there's free fonts, but a lot of times if you download some font file, you may not have a license to use it, especially on the internet. Even if you buy a license for a font to use it in print or to use, just for your own, usually they don't also allow you to embed it without also buying a web license, and that can get really expensive. So typically we're just using Google Fonts or something like that if you need to use any non-standard fonts that aren't by default loaded on the computers. So I'll show an example of using Google Fonts for internet because it's a little bit different, but they make it super easy. You just copy and paste some stuff. So Yeah, question.
If font family is every language we can use, how can we specify one font family?
Sorry, say it again.
How can I specify one font family? Because I can use any name I use, so how can I specify one?
So the font family being anything is only if you're loading in your own files. So if you're not, using font face to load in a font file, font family does need to specify a specific font that's already installed on the computer.
So the name is in the URL.
The name is just whatever you give it here. Here, so when you...
How can I pick one specific font family in my URL?
Oh, so this URL here is just the file that you downloaded. So this is a file that exists. So it's a file name that you should know. But then you can name it anything in your,
So that URL is only one font family.
Yes, correct. Yep, exactly.
So what is format?
Format is just the type of font file that you've included. So there's different types of font files. So there's true type fonts, there's like open type fonts, there's like, I think WOD is a font type. There's different types of font files, so you have to tell CSS what type of format the font file is. You should know based on whatever the file name is. You don't usually have to guess. And usually wherever you've downloaded the font from, they might tell you as well, or allow you to download multiple versions. I'll jump real quick to Google Fonts just to show you an example, because that's kind of a more real-world example of the kinds of things we would do. I think it's just fonts.google.com. So Google has this awesome service where they allow you to install fonts that they've provided without necessarily having to download it and include it and everything. So like Open Sans is a good font. You can, they've changed this and they change it relatively often. But so you can like add fonts. So say you want, okay, Open Sans, so we've added that. And then Source Sans Pro, we want that too, so we'll add that as well. And then once you've selected them, get this thing out of the way. Down here, if you open this thing, it will, it's got our two fonts, it has our embed. So they actually provide the CSS file for you. So all you have to do is copy this link and put it in your HTML. And that will load the CSS necessary to include those font files. So in fact, if we just go to, if we look at the CSS they're using at font face here. So this is how, they've got a couple of extra things in here, but so this is the CSS file that Google gives you. So they give you this URL, so you load the CSS file on your website, and they have at font face, font families, Open Sans. They're also specifying the font style and font weight, which aren't necessary. They've got the source. This is a little more complicated, but basically they're saying if it exists locally, use it there, or use this locally. They're providing some different names. Otherwise, load this URL, so they give the path to the WAF2 format, which is another font format. Then they provide the format as WAF2. So again, it's a little more complex example, but they generate that font face property for you, and you don't even have to include the CSS. You just use that link attribute to include the CSS file. So then, that's step one, is to embed the font, in the head of your HTML document, as they say. And then step two is to use the following rules. So you could say P font family is Open Sans, sans serif is the backup, that kind of thing. So they give you the font family names to use within your CSS. So that's if you want to use, you're not happy with the default fonts that you have to use and you want to use something interesting, I really recommend finding a font on Google Font and using this format. because it's already all licensed and free to use, and you don't have to worry about getting in any legal trouble. Whereas if you just go to Google for free fonts and download something, you never know, you might be required to purchase a license to be able to use it on a website. So, anyway, Google Fonts is awesome. There's also Typekit, which is owned by Adobe that you have to pay for. But I pay for Typekit, and I use it on most professional sites I develop because they have some really nice fonts that you can use, and they provide a similar service. You just include the link and reference them there. So that's how fonts work. Okay, any questions about fonts before we move on? Okay, so bold text. So we talked a little bit about how, there's our bold element in HTML that will make font bold, or the strong element. But we talked about there's also ways to change that, and you can make some arbitrary element bold or not bold with our CSS. So the font weight property is the way that we do that. So it can take two values. So there's bold and normal. Normal will unbold text. So say we had a strong tag that we did want to imply some, emphasis, some weight to some text, but we didn't necessarily want it to be bold. We might set font weight to normal and then say color equals red or something like that to still make it strong, but we don't want it to necessarily look bold, so we can actually change font weight back to normal. You can also do numeric values. I should have had that in here too. So like 100 to 900, I think, and usually just in intervals of 100, so 100, 200, 300, 400, so on and so forth. So some fonts provide that level of adjustability. Some fonts don't. It kind of depends on the font, whether there's a difference between 100 and 900 or 500. So sometimes you can kind of dial it really specific to the font weight that you want. So here's an example. So class credits, and we've set font weight to bold. So again, you could set an LI to be bold. You could set a link to be bold. Whatever you want to be bold, you can use font weight to create bold text. Similarly, font style allows us to create italic text. So there's three values. There's italic, oblique, and normal. Italic and oblique are usually similar and sometimes interchangeable. Again, it kind of depends on the font. Unless you know that there's an oblique version of the font, I would just use italic or normal. So normal will unitalicize it. So again, if you want an emphasis tag to indicate that there's some emphasis on the text, but you don't necessarily want it to be italicized, you want to like change the font color or even make it bold, something like that, you can do that. So there's what it looks like. So font dash style, and then italic would make some text italic. Questions about bold and italic? Okay. The text transform property allows us to change the case of text. I'm missing an A here. So it's pretty useful because say you have some text that you wanted to be all uppercase, but you don't necessarily want to go in and rewrite your text to make it all uppercase. Especially in the instance of I use this a lot because in our, one of the projects I work on, like on a user's profile, we want their name to be all uppercase. But the user has inputted their name. Usually when someone types their name, they don't type it all uppercase. But for style reasons, we want it to be all uppercase just because it looks cool. So we use text transform uppercase to make all of that text uppercase without worrying about what the user has inputted. So you use text dash transform, and then there's three values. So there's uppercase, which will make all the text appear uppercase. Lowercase, which makes all the text appear lowercase, also useful sometimes. Or there's capitalized, which will capitalize the first letter of each word. So capitalize could be useful for like headings. Capitalize is really handy, where you want the first letter of each word capitalized, but not necessarily every letter in general. So that can be useful for sure. So here's an example. So we had a class of credits, text-transform, and then uppercase. So these are just keywords that don't have to be quoted or anything. As in quotes, you just have the word there as the value. Okay, questions? Again, that doesn't affect, your HTML at all, or it doesn't save that data. It just affects how that text is displayed, whether it's all uppercase or lowercase or whatever. Okay, underline and strike through. So text decoration allows us to underline text. So there's 3 values. There's none, which will remove any decoration, which is really useful for links. Links by default will be underlined. A lot of times you don't want links underlined, especially if it's within some text or in a heading. We don't always want that to happen. So we can use text decoration none to remove any underlining that has been applied already. Or underline, which will just make the text underlined, or line dash through, which will strike through the text and just kind of put a line through the middle of it. So that can be useful for different things, like a to-do, and you want to show they're checked off or something like that. So for example, we would target our A's and do text decoration none. That's a really common thing to do because you don't necessarily want all of your A's underlined. So you can use text decoration none to remove that. Okay, line height is useful. So the line height property allows you to increase or decrease the spacing between lines of a paragraph. So for example, like the space right in here, we can increase that or decrease that. It can be really useful. Usually if you have a little bit extra line height, it helps make your text a little bit more readable. But you also don't want too much because then it may not look like a paragraph anymore. The property takes values in M, so similar to our font size option. So again, it's related to a baseline in the browser. So 1.4, 1.5 M's are good default values to make paragraphs of text more readable and aesthetically pleasing. So generally, anytime you have paragraphs of text, long form text, you want to increase the line height a little bit, at least to 1.4, 1.5 M's. It just kind of makes it look better. It spaces things out a little bit. It's going to take up some more room on your page, but it makes it a little bit more readable and makes it look a little bit better. Letter spacing allows you to increase the spacing between letters. So that can be useful. Usually we're doing it for stylistic purposes, not to usually makes things less readable. But say you have a heading that you want to space the letters out or something like that, you can use letter spacing to do that. Also takes values in M's. Word spacing allows you to control the gap between words. So yeah, both takes value for M. Can be useful for headings. I don't really use these a ton unless there's a stylistic reason that you want to do it. I've used it a handful of times for headings mainly, where you want a heading that kind of is spaced out a little bit or something. So here's an example. So for letter spacing, 0.2 M's, that's going to dial the letter spacing down a little bit and make the letters closer together. Okay, alignment. So text align allows you to control the alignment of text. It takes one of 4 values: left, right, center, or justify. Justify will cause every line except the last one to take up the full width of the containing box. So these are similar to text align on your word processor or something. So here's an example. So text-align center. This is the preferred alternative to using the center tag. So there used to be in HTML. Technically there still is, but it's going to be removed pretty soon. Just a center tag that you could use to indicate that anything in here should be centered. But center isn't really a good structural semantic HTML tag, right? It's indicating what the style should be, and that's what we're moving away from. So the alternative is to use the text line property in our CSS to align our text center or left or right. It'll also sometimes affect images and stuff like that. Usually anything that is inline will be affected by text-align, so you can use it to kind of center other elements on your page as well. So it's pretty useful. Text indent is also useful. It allows you to add indentation to your text. It takes values in pixels, so we just do text indent in 10 pixels, and it will move the indentation of our text over 10 pixels. So that can be useful for paragraphs. Maybe you want to target, like, use a span or something to, target the first word or something and indent it over to kind of create indented paragraphs. Okay, drop shadow. So the text shadow property allows us to create shadow around text. Pretty useful and can be used to, especially for headings and stuff like that. It can be used to make some cool shadows. So it takes a bunch of values. First is the left-right offset of the shadow in pixels. So negative values go to the left and positive values go to the right for the offset. And then we give it a top-bottom offset, so negative values go up and positive values go down. So it's kind of like, by offset, it's like we're pushing it in a certain direction, so we're pushing it to the left, or pushing it to the right, or negative to the left. There's an optional value of the amount of blur that you want to apply to the shadow. So by default, it's just an exact representation of what the text is, and we can move it around. But if we want to kind of blur it out, we can add blur. And then we provide the shadow. So here's an example of what it looks like. So we use text shadow, and then we just separate each value with a space. So a 1 pixel for the left-right offset will move the shadow 1 pixel to the right, and then 1 pixel will move it down 1 pixel, and then we've got a 3-pixel blur. So it's a blur radius. So it's like how far out should that blur be applied. So it will be 3 pixels in every direction to kind of blur it out. And then we provide a color. I'll show you some examples of this here in a little bit. There's a CSStricks.com link here too that gives some really good examples. So it's actually a really powerful property. You can use it to do all sorts of things. You can kind of create 3D looking text, especially if you use no blur. You can kind of, especially if you do the colors just right, you could use like a little bit lighter color and move it barely offset and kind of create a 3D look or an inset look. So there's a lot of different kind of strategies you can use with this to have some really cool effects. I think I've got some examples here. So these are some boring, not necessarily good-looking examples, but they show how we use it. So first we've got 1 pixel left offset, 1 pixel vertical offset, 3-pixel blur, and it's a light or like a medium gray. So it's kind of just a normal-looking shadow. Offset to the left, offset down. If we increase the offset, so from 1 pixels to 5 pixels, you can see here that the shadow is more to the left and it's more below the text. Still has the same blur, so it's the same shadow, it's just moved around a little bit differently. Here we have a one with no blur radius. So 2 pixel offset to the right, 2 pixel down, and then it's a red color, so you can tell the shadow isn't blurred at all. It's just like an exact copy of the text, but it's moved down and to the right a little bit. And then here's an example where we haven't moved it at all. So we've got 0 pixel offset for both vertical and horizontal, so it's just centered within the text. But then it's got a 10 pixel blur, so it's really blurred. So it kind of creates a centered blur or a centered shadow that goes out from the middle of the text. We can kind of go over some more examples in a little bit, and I'll show some negative offsets as well, but that's kind of a general overview of how drop shadows work. Any questions so far about shadows? Again, I'll go over a few more examples. But usually this kind of thing, even me, every time I go to do a shadow on some text, I kind of have to look up the documentation, say, okay, what's the order of those offsets again? And usually the first time I do it, it's wrong. It's like, oh, left right goes first and then top down. So you kind of have to get used to the format. But it's really useful for kind of creating a more interesting look. Okay, so one thing to talk about is there's a thing called pseudo elements or pseudo selectors, and they can be used to not just these are examples of pseudo elements, but you can use them to select different types of elements by certain properties that those elements have. So, for example, colon first letter will select the first letter, the very first letter inside of an element. Or colon first line will select the first line inside of an element. So you use these pseudo elements after your normal selector. So we've got some selector, and then right after that selector we use colon and then whatever our pseudo element selector is. So here we're selecting a paragraph with class intro, and then we're selecting the first letter of that paragraph. So here we might set the font size to 2 M's to increase the font size of the very, very first letter of the paragraph. That's kind of something you'll see sometimes in books and stuff, or a newspaper article or something where the very first letter will be larger. Also, we have a first line selector where you do, your selector, paragraph, class intro, and then colon first line. Select the very first line of the paragraph. Here we set the font weight to bold. Text indent is also a really common one if you want to indent the first line of your paragraph. So you could use text indent to add some indentation in the first line. There's several other pseudo element selectors we can use. These are kind of the ones related to styling the text that we need to talk about. So those are options. Again, you might not use them all the time, but when you do need to use them, it's really nice that they're there. There's also some pseudo classes. So pseudo elements are targeting specific elements kind of within an element. So the first letter or the first line. We can also use a similar strategy, but they're called pseudo classes to target different types of elements. So it's not necessarily, an element within an element, but it's just selecting a type of element based on different properties. So one example is using it to target different types of links. So these are all pseudo classes that we would add to a link selector. So, down here we've got A, and then we've got our pseudo class. So these are the different states of links that we can select. So just link will select links that have not yet been visited. So anything that we haven't yet clicked on. So by default, those are typically blue, right? And underlined. So we could use colon link to select any links that have not yet been clicked on. Colon visited will select links that have been clicked on. So by default, usually once you've clicked on a link, it'll then be purple. It changes the color. The browser wants to show you, hey, you've clicked on that link before. But if you don't want a bunch of links showing up as purple, you can use visited to target those links that have been clicked on and change the color to something other than purple. You can use hover to select links that the mouse cursor is hovering over. I don't know if there's, by default, any changes on hover. In most browsers at least, but sometimes you add an underline, like maybe you don't want links to be underlined by default, but when they hover over them, you do want to add that underline just to show, hey, this is something you can click on. So it's a good idea to do something when the user hovers over it to indicate that it's clickable. You can also use that to change, you can use hover on things other than links as well, so like an image or something else that you want the user to be able to interact with, you can have it change on hover. Sometimes people will have like the source of an image even change on hover. So like you've got a link or an image that's file1.jpg, and then on hover it changes to file2.jpg, so the actual image will change when they're hovering over it. Active will select link or buttons that the user is currently clicking. So those styles only apply when the button is actually pressed, so when the user is actually clicking on it. So you can use that for to kind of create buttons that when you click on the button, it might lose its 3D effect or something like that. And then focus will select form fields that are in focus when the user is inputting text. So it's not necessarily related to links, but still useful when we want to style form fields. Sometimes you'll have like the background of an input change a little bit, like have it be a little bit darker when the user has selected it, so it's clear. Like if you're tabbing across different fields, you kind of want the user to be able to see which input they're currently working on. So you might change the background a little bit of it, something like that. So focus will select whatever the user has focused on, has selected with their cursor. So again, here's an example of like changing the color when you're hovering over a link. So we've got egg:hover, and then we change the color to light blue, so that when we hover over it, the color changes a little bit. Any questions about these? Again, all of these are different states of links that we would want to style, and this is specific to form fields. I need to change the slide a little bit and make it a little bit more clear. So here's some links just for referencing these CSS properties. So again, especially if you're not, don't have a computer science background or haven't done any programming before, something that's really helpful to know is that typically as a programmer or as a web developer, you're not expected to necessarily have everything in your head all the time and to know exactly what every property does and exactly what all the options are. What you are expected to know is what's available to you and where to go to find out exactly how you use that. So knowing these references is really, really useful. So again, like my goal as a programmer isn't to know every single function possible to use within the language that I'm using, but I want to know the strategies I can employ to get what I want to get done. I want to know the different options that are available. I want to kind of have a general sense of what kinds of functions are available. So using references is not something that you should feel bad about, like, oh, I have to go look this up. I can't remember it. That's okay. You should be looking things up regularly, especially to make sure you're doing it right. There's so many different, these selectors and these properties are all slightly different. Some take pixels, some take ems, some take percentage. You have to kind of look up to know which ones are available so that you use the right one, right? We don't want to use the wrong thing, so we want to kind of double check that we're using the properties correctly. So these references are really good. Developer.mozilla.org is my favorite. The Mozilla Developer Network, or the MDN. It's an open source foundation that kind of puts that out. They're really closely tied with the W3C, so they're very aware of what's going on. They have good links to the actual specifications if you want to kind of dig into kind of the source documents. CSStricks.com is also a good website. It gives lots of examples. So if you go to like /almanac, they kind of will list all different CSS properties. It's kind of an index of their site. So that can be really, really useful. They'll show some good examples of cool ways to implement CSS rules. Here's the CSS Tricks link for font face. So if you need to include a font and you want to kind of read some more about that. Here's the CSS Tricks page as well for all the font families that we have available by default. So it's a really good kind of list of fonts that you have available. And then there's a link to Google Fonts. I'll show you this list here because it's useful. Because, by default, how do you know what fonts are available? So this just CSS font families page kind of goes through the different, these are just the default, which isn't that many that are by default installed typically. But it's kind of a good list to see, okay, these are the names of the fonts that I can use generally without having to include some font file. Okay, let me do, I think I have a demo on the shadows. Well, apparently I don't have CS, or I have box shadows. There's one in here somewhere with, oh, here we go. So, this kind of goes over a couple of other things, but so we've got a bunch of headings up here at the top, and then this first one has a text shadow with negative offsets. So we go negative 5 pixels for the horizontal offset, which is going to go 5 pixels to the left. Negative 5 pixels for the vertical offset, which goes 5 pixels up. 5 pixel blur, and then it's just gray. So, for instance, if we change this negative 5 pixels to just 5 pixels, it goes from 5 pixels up to 5 pixels down. So just, making it negative or positive changes the positioning of it in that way. Likewise, we could, change the blur. We could make this, 20 pixels if we wanted it to be really blurred. You notice the blur doesn't change, like, making a crazy value like 20 pixels doesn't make it just huge. It's just blurring it even more than it is. So it doesn't necessarily make the shadow bigger. It just makes it more blurred, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a common misconception that 20 pixels sounds like a size, but it's the size of the blur, not necessarily the size of the shadow. If you wanted it to be bigger, you can maybe add another heading, position it exactly where that is, and then make it, shadow, then that would be bigger. So anyway, you can't necessarily make a shadow bigger than the text that it's shadowing, but you can make it more blurred or less blurred. If we do like 0 blur, just to kind of show an example, let's make this a little bit bigger as well. So again, just to kind of demonstrate M's a little bit, 1M is kind of just our default font size, right? So that's kind of the same font size as our paragraph text, so it's not really any bigger. But once you go up to like 2M's, that's kind of more heading size. 3M's, I think, is what, I guess H1s are like 2.5 usually by default. Yeah, so 2.5 is about what an H1 by default is, just as a frame of reference. So we could do like, 5M's to make it really, really big. So again, I like to use M's. It's kind of a little bit more flexible because on mobile, it's going to be about the same proportions. So like an example of using shadows, if we did like 2 pixel and 2 pixel with no blur, and we made it like light gray, it kind of gives a little bit of a 3D look. You can't really tell on the screen. But by kind of using the colors wisely and offsetting it a little bit and not using any blur, you can kind of start to give a 3D look to your text by just using shadow with a small offset and a little bit different color. If we did like dark gray, kind of does a similar effect. So you can kind of tell now it's got a little bit of a 3D look to it. So it's a nice way to use shadows. Got some examples of these other properties too. So like line height for this paragraph. So like, by default, the line height, the text is kind of squished. There's not much spacing from each line to the next. It's not bad, but, your eye, as you read things, kind of, you see the lines above and below. It can kind of be easier to get lost. So if we just add a reasonable, 1.5 M's, that kind of spaces things out a little bit. It gives some separation between lines. It looks better. It's just kind of a good idea to do. But if you went up to like 3 M's, that's obviously way too much. It doesn't really look like a paragraph anymore. It just looks like some random, random words on the page. So you don't want to go too much
You want to keep it reasonable. Text align, so I've used Justify for this. Justify is really nice. It's the best looking of all of the text alignings. You sacrifice a little bit of readability because using Justify spaces between words will vary based on the line, which can be annoying because as you're reading it, some lines even will get crazy and be super spaced out to make it fit or something like that. So you sacrifice readability a little bit, but the aesthetics, it looks a lot nicer, especially if you have, think of like a newspaper. Newspapers use Justify because it just looks better. If you have columns of text, it just looks nice when they're all justified and all aligned. Whereas if they were like left aligned, you'd have this like ragged edge where the text ends and it just doesn't look as good. So Justify is nice to use when you need to kind of keep your text looking a little bit better. Text indent will indent, so like if we remove this, so yeah, text indent is actually just doing the first line as well. So like 10 pixels will indent the first line 10 pixels from the rest of the text, which is nice. Here's an example of that first line selector. So paragraph and then colon first line. So we've selected the very first line of the paragraph. We've made it bold and larger. Maybe we just want it at 1.2 ems and we don't want it bold, which is maybe a more reasonable thing to do. Even that doesn't really look that great. So there may be sometimes you would want to use that, but I wouldn't use it just to use it. Here's an example of using font weight on our H1s. So you notice our H1s here aren't bold. By default, they will be. There's not a huge difference here. That's a bold heading, whereas normal is a little bit less bold. You can also probably use 100 being the lightest. See if it changes anywhere. Yeah, so 700 is where it bumped up. So again, it just depends on the font. Some fonts will provide like a extra light, regular, semi-bold, bold version, and you can use the numbers to indicate which one you want to use. Usually each of them will have a number attached to that weight. So if you're dealing with a font that you know has multiple levels of boldness, you can use numbers here in font weight to do that. Here's an example of font style, italic, text transform, capitalize. So you notice in our HTML up here, we don't capitalize each letter. It's just the rest, other than the first word, none of the words are capitalized. So by text transform capitalize, we've made the first letter of each word capitalized. We can also do uppercase to make them all capitalized, which is nice. So we've added a little bit of letter spacing to this one. Let's drop the size here down a little bit. Here's an example too. Well, this one probably doesn't work because the changing the percentage. Okay, it is doing it just relative to what its default is, but usually percentages is just whatever the parent is, which in this case is the body. So just whatever the default font size for the body is what the percentage is doing. So the letter spacing here has kind of made the heading spaced out a little bit more. So the default would just be that. Oops. Good. Got it. Thanks. So the default letter spacing just looks like this. It's not that interesting. I mean, it works, but say we wanted a little bit more stylized look with the spaced out heading, we can use letter spacing. So if we did like something extreme, like 10 pixels, that's really stylized. It's only affecting the top one, by the way. Or no, letter spacing affects all of them. but it's not as readable at that point, so we kind of want to do something reasonable, 5 pixels maybe, so it kind of makes it look more interesting while it's still readable, not super crazy. Let's see, what else do we have? Text decoration, none on this link. So here's a link here where, you know, a lot of times if you have links within paragraphs of text, you don't necessarily want the link to be underlined. So we've done text decoration, none. But then on hover, we do text decoration underlined. So when you hover over it, it is underlined. We could also do like, you know, color light blue, so that when you hover over it, the color changes as well. So kind of up to you how you want to style that. Here's an example too. We've included the Google fonts here. So this link up at the top in our HTML. This is a CSS link. So we're including the CSS file from googleapis.com with Family Roboto. And then in our actual CSS, we can just reference that font that we've included in that CSS. So font Family Roboto, and then sans serif is the default. And that's a sans serif font. Okay, that's all. I'll post a link to this this code pen on Blackboard or Slack too, just if you want to. If you click this fork button up here, you'll be able to change it. You can't change it by default, but if you click fork, it'll copy it. You might have to create an account to do that, but it'll make a copy of it into your own account. You can kind of play with it there and just kind of mess with the values and see how things change. The next assignment I'll get posted up later today. Your assignment 3 is due at the end of the day today with the forms. So if you're having trouble getting it to submit, by the way, make sure your submission URL is HTTPS. A couple of people ran into that. So yeah, that's due at the end of the day, and I'll get assignment 4 posted later today. It's a little bit of a bigger assignment, so it's a city guide website. So you're going to create a website that's a guide to your favorite city, shows off some points of interest, has some information about the city. And then we're also going to start using our CSS that we've learned so far to style the text. So I'll get that posted later today. I think you'll have like a week and a half, so it'll be due like next Thursday. But again, there's a little more content involved and some images and CSS properties and stuff like that. So it should take you a little longer as well. So, okay, if you have any questions on anything, I'll stick around for a little bit. And otherwise, I'll see you guys on Thursday. What's up?
Okay, so first off, so
Mhm.
so my cousin, she tried to FaceTime me to class, and then she texted me. She was like, apparently my grandpa died this morning, and so
Oh no.
it's fine. Like he sucked. So like that's the thing. I don't think I'm gonna have to go to a funeral, but just a
Okay.
heads up,
Sure.
might be. But I'd be very surprised if I did. So
Okay.
got that out of the way. Okay. Second of all, is this the correct form action?
Yep. That looks good to me.
And then, so I've been having trouble, I've been having trouble, like, getting rid of those boxes right there.
This box right here.
Yeah, it's so annoying, yeah, and then,
Interesting.
yeah, I was playing around with it, I was Googling different things, I don't,
Select. It's probably the slash here.
okay.
So if it's not an empty element, meaning, so like, you know, an empty element is something that doesn't have any content
Yeah.
inside of that tag. But if it has a closing tag, so like we have a slash select here, you don't want the slash there.
Okay.
So we'll take that out.
And then also, how do I know if it's submitting properly?
It should show up in the list of reviews on the page after you submit it.
Oh, okay, and then do I check, like, on this, GitHub website?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you can check it there.
Okay.
Also, too, I think you just need the select. I don't think you need this input here. That's probably where that extra box is coming from as well.
Okay.
So for a select box, you just need the select.
Okay.
So we can get rid of that one.
Yeah.
And that should get rid of that extra box.
Okay, let's see. And then, then there was another one in my text area thing. Which we will figure out. Okay, yay, awesome. Okay, and so then I'll
Cool.
fix that other one. And then I'll ask him to show me how to publish stuff. But yeah, no, sorry if that was oversharing. I don't think I'm going to be away, but
Okay, if you need to,
it's just,
it's fine.
like, really, now, after all these years. Okay, so then right here, where it was,
What's that? Yes. Quiz 2, right? Good. There you go.
Okay, I deleted the closing tag for the input text area, and it's still there.
Okay, so for the text area, you don't need an input either. It's just text area is the input.
Oh, awesome.
So you would want to add that name attribute to the text area, and then.
So like, would it be like text? Would it be like name equals comments text area?
It would be text area and then space name equals comments.
Okay, so
But in the opening tag.
Oh, like this.
Yep. Yeah.
And then so would it be then with the your comments here be a new tag?
No, it can just be inside there.
Okay, like this.
Yep.
Okay.
But then you get rid of that input.
Yeah, this. Okay.
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep. What's that?
I have a question about grade.
Okay.
So one thing was I got off with the personal bio.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't use the HR tag right, and I just don't really know what's wrong. So I guess. What is it here?
Yeah, that looks right.
Yeah, it was
Like, is it?
because like of the backlash and stuff. Okay, so first off, so
Isn't
one of
that
my
just what
assignments,
it
I didn't
Yeah.
publish.
That looks fine to me. What else did they take points off for?
It was that and no closing address tag because so the thing is I had it at the end
Yeah.
and so it doesn't actually if I would have had something after I think it would have been weird, but since it's at the end
yeah.
it doesn't
Yeah,
it
I
looked
gotcha.
completely normal.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So I kind of understand why I got that off. But yeah, that was
Yeah, I gotcha. Shoot me an email. Just to remind me, and I'll take a look and fix the grading on it. So it's not a problem. Yep.
And then also, do you know when our next quiz is gonna be? I just remember last week it was we found out just
Yeah.
on Tuesday.